So just before we start, I'm talking about stories that I've had as a result of book publishing that I've been in for more than 50 years. All the stories are true. Some of them are because of a book, and some of the more interesting ones, books never did get published for a variety of reasons, which I'll explain as I get to. But all the stories I think you'll find very entertaining, and in some cases very unusual. So my background I'll develop as we go through these slides and talks. So my first story began when the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union went to the Moscow City Council and said, the President and Mrs. Bush are going to donate some statues to the city of Moscow as part of a summit with President Gorbachev, but we need some help. Who can help you? Who can help us? And the member of the city council in Moscow said, well, why are you talking to me? You should talk to Henry Quinlan in Boston. And so you would say, why is a Moscow city councilor recommending me? Well, back then in the era of the Soviet Union, a favor is a favor. So I did him a favor. And so he thinks he's doing me a favor, which turned out to be a big favor. So it ends in, I'm getting a call I was in my office with my cousin Dave. My secretary came in and said, Henry, the White House is on the phone. And my first reaction was, Jane, you don't have to impress my cousin. And she laughed, and no, the White House on the phone. So I got on the phone, and it was Susan Porter Rose, Mrs. Bush's chief of staff. And she said, the president and Mrs. Bush are participating in a summit with President Gorbachev in a couple of months. And they want to donate the statues, Make Way for Ducklings, to the children of Moscow. But we're having a problem with the contractor who's from Lexington, and he wants to use the biggest plane in the world to take the ducks to Moscow. And the president said, I know the ducks. They don't need the biggest plane in the world. So that's one problem. The other problem is you have to publish the book in Russian in Moscow. And since you're in the publishing business and you're doing something in publishing in Moscow, I'm sure you can do that. So I said, yes, I can, but let me try to start with the contractor. So I called the contractor in Lexington, and I said, what are you taking to Moscow that you need the biggest plane in the world? He said, well, I'm taking trucks, sand, water. I said, where the hell do you think you're going? They have trucks, they have sand, they have water. Make a long story short, they went over, the ducks themselves went over in a cargo of an airliner, and his workers went as passengers in the airline. And there they are in Boston. Nancy Schron, the sculptress, made a duplicate set for Moscow. And it's another lesson I've learned, and I've learned a lot of them. People are people. So if you go to see these ducks in Moscow, what are you going to see? Exactly what you see in Boston. Little kids sitting on the ducks and the parents taking their pictures. What is interesting in this is behind the ducks, this is a public park in Moscow. That's the Nova da Vinci Convent, built in the 16th century by the Tsar, one of the Tsars. The reason he built it, under the Orthodox religion, the Tsars were not allowed to divorce and remarry. But if they put their wife in the convent, they could divorce and remarry. So they did what any self-respecting Tsar would do. They built a convent. Then when the communists took over, it became a burial ground for communists who fell out of favor. For instance, Khrushchev is buried in that cemetery. So there is the book. Robert McCloskey came over, and that's it in Russian. As a result, the president invited me to a state dinner. And again, people are people. So there's a head table. President Bush and the Americans are on one side and President Gorbachev on the other. And I'm looking at President Bush, and he's leaning back, trying to catch President Gorbachev's eye, and someone alerts Gorbachev that Bush is leaning back. And Bush leans back, catches his eye, and says, in other words, let's go. And that ended they stood up, that's the end. So people are people. Here's another example, people are people. So the last day that President Bush was president, I was in the White House saying goodbye to Nancy. And she said, "You just missed Marilyn Quayle." I said, "Well, that's all right. I can do with that." She said, "But you have to understand, today was the first day Mrs. Bush allowed her in the First Lady section of the White House." I said, "Mrs. Bush is one tough lady." Well, it makes that divide between them a little more explainable. And there's the president at the dinner. So I've published books for 3 men in their 80s and 90s. This man was 88, professor emeritus at MIT. It's a book about his life. And one of his big complaints, and he fought his whole tenure at MIT, was he would write a paper. And then months later, he'd pick up some kind of journal and he'd see parts of his paper in there with the name of his department head on the article. And he would go and complain, and the head of the department would say, "That's life at MIT, be quiet." But he fought about that all the time. But one of the things he insisted on the book was that insert picture of him on a bicycle. And the reason he did is he wrote a book on the mechanics of a bicycle, 427 pages. I can't even begin to understand what that may entail. But in any event, he was a wonderful man. Him and his wife lived in Winchester. And in the first 100 pages of his manuscript, he talked all the time about their dogs. They loved their dogs. Then along about page 100, he got a divorce. And then the next 100-odd pages, there was no mention of the dog. So I said to him, "You got to explain, you left the reader hanging. What the hell happened to the dogs?" He smiled and he said, "Henry, I'm a professor of engineering. I built a house out back, and I simply put a tunnel between the houses so the dogs could have a free run. Simple issue, problem solved." So I did a book with Casey Jones. I think Casey lived here in Wellesley. Wonderful man. Poorly served by the Celtics at the end. And I'll explain. So in his book, he writes, there's 3 seconds left in the game. We're losing by a point to the Los Angeles Lakers. I call a timeout. We have a huddle. Go back on the floor. Larry Bird scores, we win the game. I said, "Well, you got to tell a little bit more detail. You're in the huddle. What happens? Is there a special play?" And he'd smile at me and say, "No, there's no special play. We get into the huddle. I don't say a word. Larry Bird leans in and says, "Give me the ball and get out of the way." And that was it. But KC, as I knew him better, there they are in the huddle. There's Larry Bird celebrating afterwards. He and Bill Russell, in one calendar year, they won the NCAA college championship, the NBA championship, and an Olympic gold medal, all in one, never been repeated. So he would talk often about Bill Russell. And so one day I said to him, "Well, how close are you to Bill Russell?" And as he would pause, think, then he'd say to me, "We wore each other's underwear. Is that close?" I say, "Yeah, that's close." So at the end of his career, that he didn't know was coming, but one day he's sitting in the office of Red Auerbach, and Red Auerbach had to step out, and on his desk is the payroll. And he learned that Jimmy Rogers, his assistant, was being paid more than he was. And there was a lot of talk in the sports world that KC really wasn't that good a coach. The success was because of Jimmy Rogers, who really had the basketball mind. Well, when the Celtics didn't renew Casey's contract, Jimmy Rogers was given the job as head coach. And the next 2 years were two of the worst years the Celtics had in many a year. So a little bit of justice with that one. But KC's greatest compliment, and he told me this with a certain amount of confidence, but he is passed now, so I can tell you. He said, let me tell you about the greatest compliment I ever received. So when they would go on the road, Casey was an amateur singer. So after a game, he'd always find a piano bar, and he would go and sing at the piano bar. He was in LA one time, and unbeknownst to him, a friend of his brought Frank Sinatra to hear him sing. And when it was over, Frank Sinatra called him to his table and said, "KC, you got great pipes." And he burst in a smile that would fill this room. He said, "That was the greatest compliment I ever received." And that was it. So his man on the left, Christopher Bond. Christopher was a man I met in Moscow, but he was part of the aristocracy in England. He had a townhouse in London, and a family had a 200-acre estate. The family above him, who was an earl in the same family tree, had an estate in Scotland of about 1,000 acres. And the wealth came from mining. They owned 1 million acres in Australia. So that's how that all worked. So Christopher, his wife was named Lady Elizabeth. And I met him in Moscow when I used to visit him in London all the time. So one day we're in London, and he said to me, "Come on down to the farm. I want you to meet my mother and father." And I go down there, and this is the farm. It's an 11-bedroom home. And Christopher has a cottage on the property. And so he takes me up to the home, and I go in, and then to the right. And it's a library, maybe 15-foot ceiling with books everywhere. His mother and father are sitting in opposite easy chairs in front of a fireplace with a book stand, and they're reading books. The father is in a coat and tie, and the mother's in a dress. And I stopped at the doorway, and I said, Hollywood has it right. This is what it looks like. So I met his mother and father, who were delightful people, and then we had a drink together and then went back to the cottage, and Christopher takes me up to the bedroom where I'm staying. And he said, now, Henry, be careful. I don't want you to get up tonight, get angry, and punch the wall. The wall is from the 16th century, and it's just dry cow shit. So you go right through it. So as time goes on, Christopher, mother and father die, and he and his wife get a divorce. So Christopher's now inherited the main house, the 11 bedrooms. So he decides he's going to turn it into a B&B. And my wife and I went down to visit him. And I'm going up the stairs and I see this. And I said, Christopher, why do you have this ratty old tie here? He said, Henry, a little more respect. That is Winston Churchill's tie. My father was an aide to Winston Churchill in World War II, and he said, I thought if I put the tie on a plaque on the wall, someone would steal it. So I just do it, and everyone talks like you. What's this ratty old tie? And that's kind of what Christopher's all about. So I'm reading the guest book, and I say, thank you for the wonderful weekend, William. And I said, Christopher, is that who I think it is? He said, yes, that's Prince William. And he said, the story is even better. So this is about 15 years ago. And Prince William was doing a week's army training in an army base nearby. And so Christopher said, I know him. And so I wrote to him over there and said, when you finish your training on Friday, why don't you come here, bring some friends, have dinner, and then in the morning you can go on back up to London. The Prince writes back, says, wonderful. You can pick us up at 4 o'clock. So Christopher says to a young Michael, his driver, he said, Michael, at 4 o'clock tomorrow, go over to the army base. There's a pickup area. You're going to see 3 soldiers. Pick them up and bring them here. That's all he said. So Michael goes over, sees the 3 soldiers, pulls into the parking spot. The door opens, and in steps Prince William. And Michael says, well, screw me. And they go on and have dinner. The next morning, Christopher lines up the people that work for him to say goodbye to the prince. And the last one in line is Michael. And when the prince gets to Michael, Michael is like this. And Prince William leans over to him and says, Michael, I have never been addressed by, well, screw me before. So he's got a good sense of humor. Another visitor was Prince Michael of Kent. So he drives down, and then on Sunday when he's leaving, he says to Christopher, where's there a gas station? And Christopher tells him, and he goes and gets gas and goes to London. Then 4 or 5 months later, he comes back for another visit. Then on Sunday, he says to Christopher, I'm going to that gas station to get some gas before I go back to London. He goes to the gas station, filling up the tank, and a man comes out waving a check. And he said, you're the guy. You give me this check. It's signed Michael. What the hell good is a check with Michael? What the hell is your name? And Michael said, I don't have a name. I'm Prince Michael. Well, you shitting me? And he said, I'll take another check. And he takes the 2 checks and puts them on the wall. And Michael says to Christopher when they meet in London, I love going to your place because I get free gas. He takes my checks and puts them up on the wall. So one of the more entertaining people I met in the publishing was Wally Schirra. Wally was one of our original astronauts. Very engaging personality. And so I was part of a group, and we rented a building in Moscow from the Soviet Space Agency. And we're doing it like in a merchandise mart. So I got the idea of inviting Wally over to cut the ribbon. So I called Wally in California and asked him. He said, sure, I'd love to. So Wally came over. When the Soviets heard he was coming, they said to me, would Wally go to Kyrgyzia? We have a secret space research institute there, and we're broke. We want to know if he can help us sell some of our technologies to NASA. And Wally, being Wally, said, sure, I'd love to go. So the day after the ceremony, Wally and I, that's Wally in the spaceship, and this man was a cosmonaut. That's Nancy Quinlan, the famous ambassador's daughter. She didn't come on, but this was in Moscow. So we get on an Aeroflot flight. And all the talk you hear about being nervous on a Russian airliner, Wally, you would have thought he was riding a car down in a superhighway in America. Never a nervous moment. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, I always figure the pilot wants to get there too, so I'm with the pilot. So we get to Kyrgyzia, and it's a beautiful country. It's on the border of China, and it has these beautiful white-capped mountains. And we go into, on the grounds of this research institute, and there's these, we're in a big hall, and there are tables on the scientists behind the tables, Wally and the cosmonaut and an interpreter spend 2 hours going around everything. And at the end of it, Wally said to me, you know, they're wonderful people, but by God, they're so far behind us, I can't believe it. And so that night at dinner, he says to the cosmonaut, you know, you can clear up a big mystery for the American space program. You sent up one cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. We sent up Shepard. Then you sent up, and we sent up two. And then you sent up three, and we're in Houston saying, how the hell did they fit 3 cosmonauts in that spaceship? And the cosmonaut got a big smile on his face, and he said, Wally, we go back to Moscow, I'll take you to see the spaceship and you'll understand. So we went back to Moscow, and he took Wally out. This is Star City outside of Moscow, where all the cosmonauts work and train and live. And there's a museum there, and he took Wally in to see the spaceship. And that night, Wally said to me, this is absolutely unbelievable. The way they got the 3 cosmonauts into that spaceship, they took out the seats and put in a bench just to drive the Americans nuts, and they did. And I'll never forget, Wally and I are standing in the airport on the way back, and Wally summed up the trip by saying, these guys have pulled off the biggest con job I've ever seen. What the hell were we afraid of? They're so far behind us. And then, of course, there's a famous movie, Russia House, with Michelle Pfeiffer and Sean Connery. And I'm in New York having lunch with a friend of mine. He brings a man who is a friend of his, who's Michelle Pfeiffer's agent's husband. And I said to her, how did you like making the movie? And did Michelle like the movie in Moscow? Making one, she said, she loved it. wonderful people, saw some sights she didn't know. She said, okay, what did she tell you was the hardest part of making a movie in Moscow? She said, oh, that's easy. That was keeping Sean Connery out of my bedroom. So Wally said to me, you've got to meet Joe Foss, because if Joe Foss will do a book, you'll have a bestseller. Who was Joe Foss? Joe Foss was our leading fighter pilot ace in World War II, shot down 26 Japanese planes. He was a governor of South Dakota, first commissioner of the American Football League, and head of the NRA. So he had quite a career. So my editor and I flew out to Arizona to have dinner with Joe Foss. And Joe said to me, you know, Henry, and I've heard this quite a few times, I don't want to do a book because I'd lose a lot of friends. I'll be honest. And I'm not going to do it. So, but he said, I can tell you a lot of stories. So one of the stories he tells, he's the first commissioner of the American Football League. Two young lawyers in the office, Joe Robbie and a man named Sullivan, I forget his first name. And there's a meeting coming up to award the franchise for the Miami Dolphins. And so Joe says to these two young lawyers, why don't you two put in an application to get the franchise? Because someday that's going to be worth a lot of money. So the two of them did. So the day of the meeting, they go in and they're the last group to make a presentation. They make their presentation, and the head of the Owners Association at the time was a man by the name of Sonny Werblin. He owned the New York Jets, and he was a big-time Hollywood agent. So he said, I know you two guys. You don't have any money. Where the hell's the money going to come from? And Joe Robbie says, Danny Thomas. And Joe says, he's wonderful. I know him. This is great. They award the franchise to Sullivan and Joe Robbie. They finish the meeting, they go in to see Joe Foss, and Joe Foss says, how'd you guys do? We did great, we got the franchise. And then Joe Robbie says to Joe Foss, what are you doing tomorrow? Joe Foss said, I'm not doing anything. Come to LA with us. And he said, why the hell should I go to LA with you two? Well, you're going to introduce us to Danny Thomas. And he did. And they're bumping along, and after about 10 years, Danny Thomas says, this thing is going nowhere, I'm going to buy me out. So Joe Robbie bought him out. A couple of years later, Sullivan said the same. Joe Robbie bought him out. When Joe Robbie died, the value of the team was $1.3 billion. So it was a great story. There is Joe Foss in the middle with Gino Capoletti, I think another Wellesley resident, and Billy Sullivan when he owned the Patriots. J. Courtney Sullivan and his great publishing story, she was and still is, a cousin. So she went to Smith. Her first job out of Smith is at Vogue. And she describes her first day at Vogue as, I walk into the office and I see all of these women dressed to the nines. And I had spent 4 years in my pajamas. How do you think I felt? So she lasted a couple of months and left. It just was not her. And she got a job as an assistant to Maureen Dowd at the New York Times. And she was writing a book, and Bob Hebert was also, she was working for him. and he gets her an agent. The book becomes a bestseller. Right time, right place, the whole thing just fell into place for her. Now she's on her 4th book, and she has sold 2 of them to Reese Witherspoon for movies, and who she thinks is just a really wonderful person. So I did a book with Jerry Doherty. Jerry managed all of President Kennedy's books, Ted Kennedy's campaigns. And the way he was selected was he had sent a proposal to the Ted Kennedy about how to run his campaign. He was a Democratic state chairman at the time. And so he was selected by President Kennedy, and President Kennedy invited him down to the White House. And he's sitting in the White House with Ted Kennedy, President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and their aides. The president said to him, "Jerry, I read your proposal. It is really good. And in the words of the street, my ass is on the line. If Ted doesn't win, it doesn't look good for me. So you've got to make sure he wins. And if there's anything in the campaign that you need, you call Bobby. He'll give you his private number." But then he said, but you also have to understand, Ted has a bad back like I do. And there's only so much he can do physically. In the afternoon, he has to rest his back, soak his back. So that's the parameters. So the first day they're campaigning out near Fitchburg, and they go to the plant openings, and then the coffee shops, and then the luncheons, and then at 2 o'clock they're driving to the next location. And Ted says to Jerry, "Jerry, you remember what the president said? My back is killing me. I got to soak my back." And Jerry said, "Ted, look around. We're in the woods. Where the hell are you going to soak your back? You want me to look for a stream? You can sit in a stream." And he said, no, I want a bathtub. So they keep driving, and then they come to a house, and Ted says, "Let's go knock on that guy's door, see if I can use his bathtub." So they go to the door. Jerry goes to the door, turns to Ted and says, "Ted, get out of the car so at least he can see who I'm talking about." The guy opens the door, and he says, "Can my friend Ted Kennedy use your bathroom?" And the guy said, "That's kind of unusual, but okay." Well, he says, "It's a little more unusual than that. Can he sit in your tub for 2 hours?" He said, "That is unusual," but he let him do it. So another of the famous stories is the last debate, Ted Kennedy and Edward McCormick. The last sentence in that debate was McCormick saying to Ted Kennedy, "If your name was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke." That's how it ended. And in writing the book, Jerry said, I ran over and grabbed Ted Kennedy and moved him off the stage. I said, "Well, you got to give him more information. Why?" He said, "I got to Ted Kennedy, and I knew he was getting mad. And as I got to him, he said to me, 'I'm going to punch that son of a bitch in the nose.'" And Jerry said, no, you're not," and dragged him right off So that's how that happened. But people often wonder, how did Ted Kennedy become such an advocate for health care? Well, when he broke his back, he was in a hospital up in Northampton in a striker bed where he had to change position every 12 hours. And Jerry on Saturday nights would go up there and he'd bring ice cream and a movie. And they'd watch a movie. And then they'd start talking. So he said to Jerry one time, Jerry started the conversation by telling him he had, in the second year at Harvard, he got struck with TB. And he went to a sanatorium in upstate New York for 2 years. Was bedridden for 2 years. And his father was a Boston fireman. He got a partial scholarship to Harvard playing football. But he was in the sanitarium. Then they asked for volunteers for this miracle drug. And he volunteered, and he cured the TB. Went back to Harvard, graduated, and so forth and so on. So Jerry said, so Ted said to him, well, how did your father pay for it? And Jerry said, well, Harvard helped a little bit, but my father was a string saver. He was very thrifty, so he fortunately had the money. But for most people, working class, because Jerry grew up in Charlestown, he said, people, my neighbors, someone gets sick. They don't have any money for hospitalization, certainly not for a long one. So generally there would be a collection or a fundraiser of some kind. And then if that didn't work, they had no money, then that was it. And that initiated Ted Kennedy's interest. He couldn't say, how does that happen? How does that happen? And that became his vocation, really, in the Senate. And there they are, they remained lifelong friends. Jerry was the only non-Kennedy to sit when his body was laying in state. Happy ending to the story. Jerry at 88, his wife had died 20 years ago, got remarried after he published his book, which I always use as, when you publish your life story, good things happen. So he got married, had a reception at the Kennedy Library for 600 of their favorite friends, went on to several trips to Ireland, hadn't traveled out of the country in 20 years. He just had a great thing. The woman he married, my sister, a former nun, lawyer, and judge. They had 5 wonderful years together, and Jerry passed, but you never know about life. So I always like to tell this story because it is the only Hollywood actress that gave me a kiss. So I was out in Hollywood, and an agent that I knew said, she might be a good one for a book. He set up a luncheon for her. So my editor and I went to the restaurant in Beverly Hills. And it was noontime, and the first thing that struck me, they sat us down. We were there first. First thing that struck me was all these women at noontime are dressed to the nines. I really couldn't get over it. And then I see the maitre d' leading a woman in a conservative business suit and a man, and it's Mitzy Gaynor and her husband, and they sat down. And of course she said what Joe Foss said. She said, Henry, if I did a book, I wouldn't work again. So I don't want to do a book. But we had a wonderful lunch with her. And remember her from South Pacific. And so we talked. I said, what are you going to do in your retirement? She said, my husband and I have spent our whole adult life flying New York to LA, LA to New York. We don't know what's going on in the middle of this country. And so she said, we're going to do a one-woman show. And I'm going to go to Des Moines, Iowa, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Madison, Wisconsin. And my husband's going to be my agent. And we're going to see America, which I thought was a wonderful way to do it. So here's one of my favorite stories of a book that didn't get published, and I'll explain it. So I'm walking down Fifth Avenue in a sunlit day like this, and I see a big commotion in front of me, and the crowd is gathering around. And I peek in, and there's 2 men in sport coats and ties with their arms around 2 black women who are screaming, let me go, as is the crowd. The crowd is saying, let them go, let them go. And one of them was able to pull out a badge where cops, and the other one pulled out a phone, walkie-talkie at the time, and called for help. The next thing I knew, 5 police cars streaming down Fifth Avenue, in both directions, by the way. So one of the cops really kept his cool, and I was very impressed by that. So I tracked him down, and I said, when we talked, and I said, would you like to do a book about it? We're going to call it Undercover on Fifth Avenue. So he told me the story about these women. They're part of an organized gang, and they would meet up in top of Central Park, and they'd all be assigned a certain side of Fifth Avenue between certain streets. So these 2 women had Fifth Avenue on the west side between 42nd and 45th Street between 10 and noon. And their job was to grab a pocketbook, grab a wallet, take the credit cards, go over to 7th Avenue to certain stores, spend what they had for 1 hour, and then generally the cards are canceled. So this was the plan, and each 2 or 3 blocks of Manhattan, Fifth Avenue on both sides has these groups. And I said, what happened? He said, well, we took the women down to the Tombs, which is the holding jail in the south of Manhattan, and we put them in a holding cell, and they start banging their faces on the wall and scratching them because it's brick, and then banging their faces on the bars, screaming police brutality. And the captain said, I can't deal with this, and let them go. So another interesting story he told me because of his so he would be sitting in a perch up above the organ in St. Patrick's, and his partner would be down on the floor. He'd be up there with binoculars, and for example, he'd say, on the left side, there's a woman in a green coat kneeling. She left her pocketbook behind her on the pew. Someone is walking over to grab that pocketbook. And so that's what they did. And so the whole thing to me was all this activity is going on right in front of you, and you never know it, in St. Patrick's or on Fifth Avenue or whatever. And then told more stories. So I hired a writer, and he's writing, and the author came in to me one day and said, he's mentioning all these other cops, you got to get a release. I said, okay. So I called John, and I said, John, I need 5 other people you mentioned by name. I got to get a release from them. He said, no problem. I'll get them together. Come on down with the releases. So I flew to New York, met John, picked me up. We went to a bar on 7th Avenue, O'Grady's. John said, give me the release. He said, wait here. He goes over, and the 5 of them are at the bar. They're reading and the next thing I hear is, you cheap son of a, you're getting all the money, we're getting nothing. They all started a big argument. That was the end of the book. They wouldn't sign. So another police book, tell you how times have changed. As a young cop, he was shot back in the 1960s. Very few, if you remember back, very few police were ever shot. But he was shot, and he became a hero, and went on, Connolly became a deputy superintendent. So I approached him one day because he was so well known. I went over and visited him. I said, would you like to do a book? No, I'm not doing a book. I said, well, you've had an illustrious career. No, I'm not going to do a book. I'm not an author, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, think about it, and I'll come back in a month. I go back in a month, sit down, He opens the drawer, pulls out, he said, well, the first 40 pages are. So once that germ permeates, and people generally want to do it. So he writes in his book, he's a young rookie cop, and the captain calls him into his office one day and said, tomorrow you're going to be part of a detail representing this district for the funeral of a cop, and go and you'll be part of the honor guard. So the next morning he gets his shoes shined and his fresh uniform and goes out and joins them. And he said, I'm standing there as a 21-year-old true believer, Boston police. And he said, next thing I know, I'm hearing one guy next to me say, anyone know this guy? Another one says, yeah, I heard he's a jerk. Another one says, no, he's not a bad guy. Another guy says, well, maybe. Another one says, when can we leave and get a drink? Another one says, well, we have to stand here all day. And all this banter is going back and forth. And he's totally crushed as a young rookie. He goes home that night, goes in, says to his wife, no cops at my funeral. So here is a man who, the reason I got involved in Russia, he was a young Soviet diplomat back in 1986, appearing before Congress about Chernobyl. And he said, he explained to Congress what was going on, but in his bio it said he'd lived in Washington for 5 years, spoke perfect English. So I got the idea of, would he want to write a book about comparing Moscow to Washington? So I called him up. And I'll never forget his opening, who are you, what do you want? And I told him, he says, I'd like to do that, but I'm so junior here, I don't have that kind of authority. He said, call me tomorrow, I'll see if I can get authority. So I called him the next day. He got authority. And so he said, come on down to the embassy and we'll sign the contract and start the book. So I flew to Washington with my wife, meeting with him at the embassy at the time. And I said to my wife, would you like to go with me over to the Soviet embassy? And she says, I wouldn't go near that place. I said, well, I'm going over. So over I went. And we sat up in the embassy at the time was the former Pullman Railroad estate, Pullman family. And we sat up in the ballroom, which was all gold mirrors. It was a beautiful facility. We sat there for 2 hours, talked about the book, the contract, came to an agreement pretty quickly. Then I said to him, I told him the story about my wife. And he said, well, why don't you go get your wife? He said, I'll give her a private tour of this beautiful building. So I went back and got my wife. As we got to the front steps, he was standing there. He said, Mary, come on in. No reason to be fearful. So that started a 40-year friendship. And that's him after we signed the contract that night, and his wife, Irina. Make a long story short, the book never got written. When Soviet Union collapsed, he became an ambassador to Chile. From there, he went to Mexico, to NATO. To show you what, he had a really good sense of humor. He said when he was ambassador to NATO, every year the Russian ambassadors meet in Moscow for an annual meeting, and he stands up at one of them and says, hey guys, if you want to invade Europe, do it in August. They're all on vacation. He said, I thought it was funny, no one else did, but that's who he was. In the year 2000, Putin appointed him the Russian ambassadors to the UN. And things I learned from his wife, not from him, was their next door neighbor at their dacha was Putin. And, about the wealth of the government elites in Moscow, in Russia, comes from real estate. So they're all assigned, and their family, apartments. So when he died, his wife had 5 apartments in Moscow she owned, all with a value of $3 to $4 million. So, but he was a really, that's him with Lavrov, and his favorite ambassador at the UN was the American ambassador. And he thought she was probably the smartest person in the building.
What was his name?
Huh?
What was his name?
Vitaly Churkin. I was interviewed by the Pentagon who was going to succeed Putin, and they selected 3 people, Vitaly and 2 others. And he was the only one oriented to the West. The other 2 were oriented towards China. He died. Our last dinner was in August of 2016. And he died shortly thereafter at his desk. And he had the Russian problem of rich food, fair amount of drink, no exercise. I remember saying to him at dinner, do you ever walk to the UN? He had a townhouse on 76th Street. He said, no. He said, I really should because I get it. I'm driven there every day. But he didn't. And so when I was in Russia too, this man I played tennis with all the time. And he was one of the icons of Russian hockey. But if you look at the expression on his face, people always say to me, you know, those Russians, they never smile. Well, under the Soviet system, they were taught not to smile or to frown, because someone may tap you on the shoulder and say, what are you happy about? What are you sad about? Then you get put down in a book somewhere. So they tend to go around with this neutral face. But he had one of the most engaging personalities of anyone I've ever met in my life. And there he played in that favorite series back in 1972. And he visited me one time, and Brad Park came in to visit him. And Brad Park brought the apology from Bobby Clark, who in that series broke the ankle of the best Soviet player. So it was like 30 years late, but it was nevertheless was there. Russian mafia. So this is probably typical when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was just absolutely a free-for-all. There were 5 Irish guys who founded the first supermarket, and this is the entrance. It goes upstairs, and it was quite large. But it was the only Western supermarket in Moscow, so they did a great business. Then they built a nightclub, a women's store, and men's store. So they were making a ton of money. But the problem was they had 100 Russian employees who were being paid on the scale of Russia, and 25 Irish who were being paid on the scale of Ireland. And they were like this, the 2 scales. And so certainly the Russian employees soon found out, and they staged a coup. So one night, a gunman with a ticket and a gun went to the apartment of all the Irish and said, tomorrow there's a plane for Dublin, here's your ticket. And if you don't go, this is the result. And they all went back to Dublin, and the Russians took over their business. That was part of the craziness of business when Soviet Union collapsed, and there were no courts. As a matter of fact, the only redress you could have was the mafia, which is hard to imagine, but that was the truth. So I met the Tin Man with a mutual friend. Now this is a good example how one incident can change your whole life. So he was number 2 selection for the Tin Man. And the first selectee, he couldn't take the metallic makeup that was on his skin. he would break out in a severe rash, so he couldn't take it. So Jack Haley took it, and he went into a real estate deal in the 30s with a friend of mine. They bought 8,000 acres of land in California. By the way, this friend of mine was 40 years older than me, so so my friend sold out. He said, one of the more classic lines, who the hell would want to live in California? Jack Haley went on, he sold it for a total of billions of dollars. But I talked to him, and he was a very gracious, grew up in Dorchester, big supporter of Stonehill College. Very nice man, and he's dead too. So O.J. Simpson, I did a series of seminars with Phil Van Atta. Phil was the arresting officer, and he told me, he said, obviously, O.J. Simpson killed his wife. There's just no ands, ifs, or buts about it. But the tenor of the times, he was found not guilty because of a lot of the racial problems in L.A. And so I did a series of seminars with Phil around the country, mostly for police officers about high-profile cases, and he was treated as absolute royalty. But one of the more interesting stories was we're walking down, again, Fifth Avenue in New York, see three large black men coming towards us, and they have New Orleans Saints jackets. And Phil says to me, this could be a problem. As they get closer, they recognize Phil, and they come running over and says, Phil, you wish you would put that bastard in jail. So he was completely relieved. There's Furman, who Phil wanted to get rid of, and Marcia Clark wouldn't. So this is one of the more ugly experiences I've ever had in publishing. I did a book with the archivist of the Archdiocese. And so he called me one day, said, you got to come out to the Chancery. They're going to do a publicity picture of you, me, and the Cardinal in the book for publicity. So I went out and we met in a library. And I'm standing there with their archivist, who was a nice young man. In comes Cardinal Law. No, hello, how are you? Has the book, never says anything to the guy who works for him. Takes the picture and walks out. It was the coldest experience I ever had in my life. And so I was at a book party, and met Anthony Lucas, who wrote the book on busing. And so I asked him, what's your next book? He said, since I've been in Boston, I've been intrigued by the stories I've heard about Cardinal Cushing. So he said, I went up to the Archdiocese to look at what's available for background. There was nothing. He had burned all the papers before he died. There were 6 pages that he gave to his sister. Everything else had burned. For reasons, who knows? So this is my final story, but this is the best. This is without a doubt the toughest man I ever met in my life. First of all, was an FBI agent, was a Jewish FBI agent, and there aren't many. He was head of the Russian Mafia unit. He put the head of the Russian Mafia in prison in America for 10 years. He was absolutely fearless. When he retired, he was hired by major corporations investigating money laundering. And in one of these investigations, he went into Iran undercover in a Canadian film crew who was making a documentary. Someone turned him in, and he was arrested. This is the first picture. He was arrested in 2007. This is the first picture of him in 2014, and unfortunately he died in 2019. Every president tried to get him out, but he couldn't. And I always thought in the beginning he was going to be traded for someone, but it never was. But if anyone could withstand it, it was Bob. He was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. So that's my stories.